In the year 1589, deep inside a locked chamber of the Louvre, a solitary figure stood before a mirror. The air was heavy with the scent of rosewater and powder. In the reflection, a man's face slowly transformed into something else entirely. His hands, pale and elegant, adjusted the folds of a silk gown, its golden embroidery glimmering faintly in the candlelight. A daring neckline revealed a powdered chest, pearls cascaded down his neck. Delicate earrings swayed with each movement. A cascade of blonde curls, crafted from the finest wigmakers in France, framed a face touched with rouge. In that fleeting moment, the man in the mirror was no longer Henry III, King of France. He was someone else. Someone softer, yet strangely commanding. A hidden persona known to almost no one beyond the palace walls. For years this secret identity was the king's private refuge from the storm of politics, war, and betrayal that surrounded him. In public, he was the last ruler of the Valois, a monarch navigating a kingdom torn by religious conflict. But in private, he was a different kind of ruler entirely, one who found peace not in armor and swords, but in silks, perfumes, and the elegance of transformation. But how did the boy who once played dress-up in the palace become the most controversial monarch in French history? And how did this hidden truth become the weapon his enemies used to destroy his reputation for centuries to come? To understand, we have to go back, long before the mirror, long before the crown, to the moment he entered the world. But the boy who would become this hidden monarch was never meant to be ordinary. In fact, from the day he was born, the court already sensed he would be trouble. On September 19, 5051, inside the grand halls of the Palace of Fontainebleau, a boy named Alexandre-Édouard de France was born. He was the fourth son of King Henry II and the formidable Queen Catherine de' Medici, a woman feared and respected in equal measure across Europe. From the very start, Alexander seemed different. His brothers fit neatly into the roles expected of princes. Charles was drawn to the art of war. Francois thrived in the hunt, galloping through forests with the reckless courage of a born nobleman. But Alexander, he preferred the quiet company of the court ladies. While other boys his age learned to fence, he lingered in the palace corridors, watching the women arrange their gowns, listening to them recite poetry, or studying the delicate sparkle of their jewels in the candlelight. He admired the precision of their hair, the way silk moved like water when they walked, and the perfume that lingered in the air after they left. His father, a hardened warrior king, saw these interests as troubling, unmanly, even dangerous in a world where a prince's worth was measured by his strength in battle. But his mother, ever the strategist, saw something else. She knew the French court was as much about appearances and charm as it was about armies and laws. A son who understood elegance and subtlety could wield influence in ways a sword never could. Still, she tried to temper his inclinations. Stricter tutors were assigned. Lessons in horsemanship, archery, and hunting filled his schedule. Yet the pull of the ladies' chambers was irresistible. And then, one day, when Alexandra was just 9 years old, the facade cracked wide open. During an important religious festival, the young prince disappeared. Panic swept through the palace. Servants searched the gardens, the kitchens, the stables. Nothing. Hours later, he was found in the private rooms of one of his mother's ladies-in-waiting, wearing her most extravagant gown. The boy did not deny it. When confronted by his furious father, he simply said, "I wanted to know what it feels like to be as beautiful as the ladies of the court." The punishment was swift and severe, but repression only drove Alexandra's desires underground. From that day on, he learned the first rule of survival in the French court: hide in plain sight. And under his mother's discreet protection, he began building a secret world, one that would eventually follow him to the throne. And as fate began to move pieces on the royal chessboard, Alexander would find himself caught between two worlds, one in the light and one in the shadows. By the time Alexander was 12, fate had already begun rearranging the pieces of his life. In 1563, tragedy struck. King Henry II, his father, died in a brutal jousting accident when a splintered lance pierced his helmet. The crown passed briefly to Alexandra's older brother Francois II, but the new king ruled for barely a year before dying under suspicious circumstances. Whispers of poison drifted through the corridors, though no proof ever surfaced. The next heir was young Charles IX. Barely a child, so their mother Catherine de' Medici stepped in as regent. Alexander, now the Duke of Anjou, was suddenly only a heartbeat away from the throne. Under his mother's watchful eye, he was schooled in the cold mechanics of power, diplomacy, court intrigue, and the theatre of public appearances. But alongside these lessons came another education, one invisible to all but a chosen few. With the help of loyal servants and the quiet permission of Catherine herself, Alexandra began refining a hidden self. It wasn't the innocent dress-up of his childhood anymore. This was transformation, deliberate and exact. His gowns were chosen for their cut and weight, his wigs styled to match the latest court fashions, his makeup applied with the precision of an artist. He moved differently, graceful, measured, each gesture calculated to match the persona he now called Henriette. One diary, long forgotten in the archives of the Louvre, captures a glimpse of these secret moments. Written in his own hand at 16, it reads, "Today I remained Henriette for 2 hours. Madame de Montmorency passed me in the corridor and did not know me. She said I was one of the most elegant ladies she had ever seen. The joy I felt cannot be described." But the French court was not a safe place for indulgence. Alexandra's life was about to be thrust into a far more dangerous arena, one that cared nothing for silks and sonnets. In 1569, at only 18 years old, he was appointed commander of the royal army by his brother King Charles IX. The decision stunned the nobility. Could a prince known for delicate mannerisms and love of poetry command hardened soldiers in the bloodiest battles of the French wars of religion? The answer came quickly on the fields of Jarnac and Moncontour. Alexandre proved himself a strategist of remarkable cunning. His troops followed him with unexpected loyalty, his sharp instincts and attention to detail winning the day against Protestant forces. The same qualities that made him an artist in private, intuition, patience and precision, became his greatest weapons in war. Yet even on the battlefield, his private rituals endured. After each victory, he would retreat to his tent for hours, emerging with a fresh floral scent and a strange calm that seemed almost out of place among blood and mud. His soldiers learned not to ask questions, but victory on the battlefield was only the start. Soon, an unexpected crown would take him far from France and give him more freedom than he had ever known. In 1573, an unexpected twist of diplomacy opened a door Alexandre could never have imagined. Through a carefully orchestrated campaign by Catherine de' Medici, complete with generous bribes, whispered promises, and marriage alliances, Alexandre was elected King of Poland and Grand Duke of Lithuania. For him, this wasn't just a crown, it was a lifeline. Far from the judgmental whispers of the French court, he could rule on his own terms. When he arrived in Krakow, the Polish nobles expected a monarch molded in the image of their own traditions, stern, masculine, and austere. What they got instead was a court unlike anything they had seen before. Henry, as he was now called, brought with him a hand-picked circle of young French companions. The Polish nobility mockingly called them les mignons, the darlings. They were beautiful, refined, and utterly devoted to their king, and in the privacy of the royal apartments they became more than companions. Behind closed doors the palace transformed into a theatre of fantasy. Gowns of shimmering velvet and silk replaced armor and doublets. Wigs were powdered, corsets tightened, and jewels fastened until candlelight danced across every surface. The king himself often emerged in a transformation so complete that even seasoned courtiers would have struggled to recognize him. One Venetian ambassador, both fascinated and unsettled, described a gathering where the king and his favorites appeared as noble women of such convincing elegance that they might have fooled even their own husbands. Artificial curves, styled hair, and layers of perfume blurred the lines between illusion and reality. For Henry, these nights were more than indulgence. They were freedom, a place where power didn't have to be draped in armor, and beauty could be as commanding as a sword. But paradise rarely lasts. In May of 1574, a messenger brought news that would rip Henry from this world he had built. His brother, King Charles IX of France, was dead, with no heir. The French crown was his. The escape had ended. Now he would return to Paris, not as the Duke of Anjou, not as the king of a distant court, but as the ruler of a nation ready to judge his every move. Paris would not welcome him home with open arms, and the game of survival was about to turn deadly. Henry's journey back to France was as calculated as any royal campaign. In Venice, he lingered for days, buying rare silks, intricate jewels, and the most luxurious perfumes Europe could offer. Officially, they were gifts for his future queen. In reality, many were destined for Henriette, the private self, who would follow him to the French throne. That same year, he was crowned King Henry III of France in a solemn ceremony at Rennes Cathedral. For the court, this was the return of a monarch to restore order to a fractured kingdom. For Henry, it was the beginning of the most dangerous balancing act of his life. The Louvre soon transformed under his rule. It became a center of culture and refinement, a place where art flourished, fashions shifted overnight, and elegance was as important as diplomacy. But the king's inner circle, those mignons from Poland, were never far from him. They were as much a part of his public image as they were of his private world. And it was in the hidden chambers of the palace that Henry's rituals truly came alive. Witnesses spoke of hours spent in transformation, wigs carefully set, gowns layered in shimmering fabrics, makeup blended with the precision of an artist. When he emerged, he could glide down a corridor so convincingly that even palace servants would bow, mistaking him for a visiting noblewoman. Then, in 1575, he married Louise of Lorraine-Vaudémont in what was expected to be a cold political arrangement. But to everyone's surprise, the match grew into something genuine. Louise was intelligent, discreet, and most importantly, unshaken by her husband's eccentricities. In time, she became his confidant and even his quiet accomplice. Records from the 19th century reveal that she sometimes lent him her gowns and jewels for his transformations. On rare nights, she joined in, helping Henry and his favorites with makeup and roles for their elaborate private performances. To outsiders, theirs might have looked like a distant royal marriage. In truth, it was an alliance built on trust, shared secrets, and a kind of intimacy few would understand. But while love could protect his heart, it could not shield his crown. The same traits that made Henry unique, the silks, the perfumes, the mignons, were being twisted into weapons by his enemies. Whispers became pamphlets, caricatures spread across Paris, mocking his masculinity and painting him as unfit to rule. In a France where strength was measured in steel and blood, the image of a king in lace and pearls was political poison. And when his enemies struck, they wouldn't come with swords alone. They would bring a city to its knees. By 5088, the whispers had become shouts, and the shouts had turned into calls for revolt. At the center of it all was the Catholic League, led by the powerful Guise family, their influence bolstered by Spain's military support. They painted Henry not as a king, but as a danger to France, a ruler too soft, too decadent, too distracted by his silks and companions to defend the faith. On a May morning, Paris exploded. It began with barricades, improvised walls of barrels, stones and timber thrown up in the narrow streets. Within hours, the city was in open rebellion. The Catholic League supporters swarmed through the capital, armed and shouting, their loyalty pledged not to the crown, but to the Duke of Guise. For Henry III, the humiliation was complete. The King of France, once commander of victorious armies, was forced to flee his own capital in disguise, slipping away from the city that had crowned him. He retreated to Blois, far from his beloved mignons, far from the silks, the perfumes, and the private sanctuary of Henriette. Cut off from his inner circle, he sank into a darkness that even his closest advisers feared. Witnesses described him as pale, withdrawn, and aged beyond his years. The sparkle, the theatre, the calculated grace, all of it seemed to fade. But Henry was not a man to accept defeat quietly. In December of that same year, he struck back with a move as theatrical as it was brutal. On the 23rd, he invited his greatest rival, Henry of Guise, to a private audience at the Château de Blois. The Duke expected negotiation. Instead, he was ambushed and cut down by the king's guards in a flurry of steel. By morning, the Duke's brother, a cardinal, was executed as well. 2 days, 2 assassinations. The message was clear: the crown still had teeth. But in killing his enemies so openly, Henry had crossed a line that could not be uncrossed. The murders shocked France, deepened the hatred of his opponents, and left him even more isolated than before. The stage was now set for the final act of his reign, a final act that would end in betrayal, steel, and the extinguishing of both a dynasty and a secret world. But before the final curtain fell, Henry would face betrayal that came wearing the robes of faith. After the bloodshed at Blois, Henry's grip on power was fragile at best. The Catholic League's fury only intensified, and his list of allies grew dangerously short. Even those who once supported him hesitated to be seen too close. In Paris, the streets buzzed with talk of vengeance, of holy justice, of a king who had forfeited his right to rule. Henry retreated to the royal camp at St. Cloud, clinging to what authority he could still muster. But without his mignons, without the velvet cocoon of his private world, he seemed a hollowed version of himself. Gone was the dazzling courtier who could charm with a smile and outmaneuver with a whisper. What remained was a man worn thin by years of political war and personal exile from the life that gave him peace. On the morning of August 1st, 1589, a young Dominican friar named Jacques Clement arrived at the camp, claiming to carry urgent intelligence for the king. Henry, weary but curious, granted him a private audience. What happened next would seal his fate and the fate of his dynasty. Clement stepped forward, speaking quietly. Then, with no warning, he drew a dagger and drove it deep into the king's abdomen. The blade tore through silk and flesh, and Henry collapsed. Guards rushed in, but it was too late. The assassin was cut down on the spot. Yet the wound he left was mortal. Henry lingered through the night, summoning the man who would succeed him. Henry of Navarre, a Protestant ally who had fought alongside him against the League. In his final breaths, Henry spoke words heavy with regret. "My brother, you see how I die for having delayed in recognizing the true servants of God?" At dawn on August 2nd, the last king of the Valois line was gone. He was just 37 years old. With him died a dynasty that had ruled France for over 2 centuries, and a world of secrets the public would never fully see. History would reduce him to a scandal, but the truth of who he was would take centuries to surface. In the centuries that followed, Henry III's name would be dragged through history's dust. Pamphlets, caricatures, and whispered stories painted him as vain, decadent, and unfit to rule a monarch who lost his capital, his crown, and his life, because he could not be the man his people expected. The mignons were remembered as frivolous parasites. His taste for perfume and pearls was mocked as weakness. But buried under the scandal and satire lies a more complicated truth. Henry was a man born into an age that demanded one kind of king, yet his soul reached for another. He was expected to embody brute strength, but he found beauty in grace. He commanded armies with cold precision, yet sought refuge in silk and poetry. He was both warrior and artist, ruler and dreamer, king and queen in one body. Modern historians, combing through letters, diaries, and forgotten archives, have begun to see what his enemies worked so hard to erase, that Henry's private world was not just escape, but resistance. In transforming into Henriette, he wasn't hiding from his role. He was reclaiming himself in a court that would never have allowed him to be whole. Even Queen Louise's quiet participation tells its own story. She didn't just accept his secret, she became part of it. Their bond was not built on appearances, but on trust, complicity, and the understanding that love can exist far beyond the narrow definitions of their time. Perhaps the greatest tragedy of Henry III's life wasn't that he was assassinated, but that the world never allowed him to be fully seen. Behind the crown, behind the gossip, there was a human being living a double truth, a truth so fragile it could only exist behind locked doors. And so history remembers him as the last king of a dying dynasty. But maybe, if we look closely enough, we can see him as something more. A man who, in the face of war, politics, and the crushing weight of expectation, dared, if only in the flicker of candlelight before a mirror, to be exactly who he was. Maybe the world wasn't ready for Henry III. But perhaps now, centuries later, we finally